And I saw that education was a key for change and for understanding, mainly because in my own education, I hadn't been given that opportunity to explore the moral status of animals.
As young vegans, they come up against the hidden curriculum. They come up against schools that aren't willing to meet their dietary preferences. They come up against prejudice, not just from peers, but from teachers. It's possibly the best, most empowering decision I've ever made. And it's empowered me in ways that I didn't think that it could.
And in my own experience, I didn't need the Cambridge Declaration to know all of my animals are sentient, loving, empathetic beings.
Hi, Heather and Michelle. How are you two?
Great, thank you.
Yeah, hi.
Well, it's lovely to meet you, Heather, and it's great to talk to you again, Michelle. We've had quite a few chats, and I'm very excited to bring you both on as guests to the Sentientism podcast, because I find your work in the education space, both of your work, deeply inspirational. And Michelle, you've been so helpful to me as I've sort of been doing some amateurish work in the UK education space too. So it's wonderful to get the chance to talk to you. And partly because I think personally of education as being one of the places where so many of our problems start, whether it's education in the schools or in the home or in society, but it's also where maybe many of the deep solutions might lie too. So this is one of my favorite topics, and you're my two perfect people to talk about it with. So this series of conversations, just to set the scene, about what I think of as the deepest philosophical questions, and they're ones I think are often neglected, particularly in education. And they're questions like, what's real, or even deeper than that, how should we understand this crazy universe? And just as importantly, they're the foundational questions of ethics, what matters and who matters. And I have an obvious bias because I'm trying to popularize and develop sentientism as a worldview that you could summarize as evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings, that answers the what's real question with a, look, we don't know, but let's use evidence and reason to work it out, with a lot of humility, change our mind as the evidence changes. And on the ethics side, it says, again, there's loads of different ways you can think about ethics, but surely every sentient being, every being that can feel, that can experience, should matter. And they should matter seriously, right? Not in some tokenistic way. They should matter seriously and practically. But I'm in these conversations talking to people with a dazzling variety of different perspectives, some of whom agree and some of whom don't agree with sentientism. So it'll be really interesting to explore your own philosophical journeys and how that underpins the work you do today. But before we get onto those big questions, maybe we should start with introductions. I don't know, Heather, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so I'm Heather Marshall. I'm a senior lecturer at Jagiellonian University. My main day job is training teachers, particularly RE teachers. But I'm involved in all sorts of other aspects of education and academia alongside that. A couple of years ago, I completed my doctorate looking at vegan young people within the school system and some of the challenges that they face. So, yeah, I mean, I'm vegan myself, so it's kind of an academic but also personal interest in the topic, I suppose.
Nice to be able to tie the two together. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was a classroom teacher for a decade in Liverpool, so I understand the challenges of the young people that I'm kind of preparing my trainees for, and also that I work alongside as well.
Yeah, you've been on the front lines for a decade as well, not just in academia. And I had the pleasure of interviewing at least one of your colleagues at Edge Hill as well, Richard Twine, a while back too. So, yeah,
he's brilliant.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah,
awesome.
Very lucky to work with Richard.
Yeah. So Michelle, how about you?
So a little bit about my life and work. Well, it's nearly 7 decades, so where to begin? Obviously born in the UK. I think important to say that father Polish, mother English, because my Polish heritage very important to me, and the history. I've always been more interested in the arts and humanities than the science. So my first degree was in social anthropology. I'm really sort of interested to know how society works, how individuals function, even an understanding of myself. So I was, drawn to the humanities. After that, I studied law, became a barrister, working for the CPS and as a magistrate. I think I was really interested in human rights and well, sort of in my own little way, wanting to help deliver justice, not just for the victims, but also for the defendants, to try and be a check and balance in the system, I suppose. 50 became vegetarian vegan, and that was the big change. And that's when my focus went towards advocating for animals, for their rights. So human rights, animal rights, hand in hand, really. And I saw that education was a key for change and for understanding, mainly because in my own education, I hadn't been given that opportunity to explore the moral status of animals. So I began researching, looking at worldviews, the psychology, the work of Mark Bekoff, Melanie Joy in sociology.
Both previous guests, actually.
Yeah, I saw that podcast. Brilliant. Matthew Cole, his book, just how we're socialized into speciesism and how education perpetuates that. So I looked at studied about empathy, and it's a valuable skill, and humane education. And I thought, right, this is where we begin. And I founded Veganism in Education, or VAN for short. We launched our first set of resources. I commissioned RE today, Angela Hill, the amazing Angela Hill. Ethical veganism as a religious and non-religious worldview. I partnered with some great people. Speaking to yourself was great because that put Sentientism in there, because I wanted religious and non-religious worldviews to be featured in the resources so children can critically think all the options for themselves. That's really important. Critical, objective and pluralistic resources. With the Animal Interfaith Alliance, we've sponsored a fabulous competition, the Spirited Arts. Again, I think the arts are a great way for people to explore their beliefs and understanding.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
And we're now partnered with the Vegan Organic Network. We're bringing veganic growing and ethics into schools. We'll be doing resources, workshops, visits to veganic farms. And I think this is going to be a really big contribution to education on sustainability and climate change, because it's not there at the moment. That's in the spectrum of choices. That option for sustainability and future doesn't feature. So we're filling that gap.
Brilliant. Thank you. And you've queued up so many of the topics we'll talk about. It's sort of obvious how your personal philosophy runs through your work for both of you here too. And it's a really powerful link. So let's start with the first of these big philosophical questions, the one about what's real, or more deeply than that, how do we go about believing? And that covers, every question, every factual question you might imagine. But an interesting way into it often is my guest's story with respect to the supernatural or the spiritual or the religious, and how they grew up, whether it was in that sort of context or something that was maybe more scientifically minded or naturalistic, or a combination of the two. And then how they're thinking about those sort of big questions has shifted over time, if it has. So Heather, do you want to go first on telling that story?
Yeah, I mean,
and you can be as open or as, I'm aware these are very sort of personal topics, so feel free to draw the boundaries wherever you're comfortable.
It's an interesting journey for me, really, because I haven't been brought up to be particularly spiritual, although obviously I've got an interest in religion. I taught RE. I did a sociology degree, so I'm really interested in society and how societies grow. And so, yeah, I've got quite a secular worldview, really, but I understand the importance of religion, and I understand the impact of religion and why people might want to be involved in that. So I think I've been brought up in a way that develops kind of critical thinking and questioning and that kind of stuff. I suppose I am quite scientific, so I do look for proof. But I also recognise, being a sociologist as well, I do recognise that things are beyond the physical as well.
Yeah.
And so I am quite scientific, but I'm a social scientist, probably more than an empirical kind of quantitative scientist, if that makes sense.
So you recognise that, you might be naturalistic in a very broad sense of using evidence and reason to understand things, but you don't think of everything as just, bits of matter bumping around. You see the reality of social constructions or subjective perspectives or personal experiences, as part of nature. But
100%. Yeah. And I'm really interested in the psychological side. We're quite interested in how the brain works and all of those kind of things as well. So, yeah, I don't really concern myself so much in the kind of metaphysical. So I'm not like generally that concerned about, say, what happens after death, or, I just feel, yeah. So, and that's kind of probably seems a bit weird for someone that teaches RE. I'm interested in other people's beliefs and why they might believe it, but I'm not that interested in exploring it for myself personally. That probably seems kind of in conflict.
No, that's fascinating. Thank you. And how about you, Michelle? What's your story on that front?
So my understanding of reality and belief has just evolved over time, and I'm still learning. I never shut a door. I'm forever open to ideas, beliefs. I value good science, but I approach that with the same caution as I would a religious dogma. And neither are flawless. And likewise, myself, how I experience myself has developed over time. So that's subjective reality. And, I've concluded that I am mind, body, and spirit. That's how I feel. And I feel this profound interconnectedness with animals and nature, and that there is something greater than ourselves. Sort of like, perhaps, in line with Einstein's Spinoza's God, where it's the harmonious order of existence, not sort of human affairs. And that's far removed from my parental upbringing. Strict Roman Catholic, yeah. Parents had 6 children, so that's proof of that.
Only 6.
Yes, only 6. That was a couple died, but yeah. We had family pets, but we never questioned the meat on our plate. My father was a scientist, so I was never brought up with that sort of conflict between science and religion. They just seemed to be working in different spheres. Both at home and at school, right? We were never allowed to discuss other religions or beliefs. There's only one Catholic church, and I think that was very wrong. It should be up to the individuals to critically explore what's out there to get your own moral or spiritual compass.
Did you ever test those boundaries, or was it just not something you even thought to do?
I don't think you dare.
Yeah.
And I would have admired those that do. I have to say, I should have. I must probably sense something was wrong. But, when it's normal, necessary, and, why would your parents or school not be ethical and moral?
There's some parallels there, aren't there, with these social norms?
Yeah. So shame on me for listening to them. And so I left school with no sense of really being a Catholic. They're just scary figures. No connection with God, really, or my own spirituality, apart from maybe thinking the sum of the whole was more than the individual parts. There was something about life that I couldn't quite put my finger on, but didn't explore it. The worst part as well about being brought up Catholic was this idea of dominion, and it was really lived. Animals are for our use, exploitation. That was, taken for granted. But so there wasn't any chance to explore, say, for example, in RE, any moral status of animals. But then science was just as bad, if not worse. That speciesism, the dissections, the classification of animals,
Sometimes the denial of their sentience and their experience.
Sentience on the top, yeah. Oh, yeah, animals have instincts, So a mother, if you take away a baby animal from a mother, she's not distressed. She's just acting out of instinct. Only we have reason. Only we have love or feelings or empathy. Wrong. So that was that. But obviously at 50, I had a road to a Damascus moment and became vegan.
Just to summarize this sort of your answer to the what's real question. So you're brought up in a Catholic context. I'd imagine you sort of believed that stuff at the time, but also were just felt you couldn't challenge it. It feels like where you've got to now is a really interesting point where, again, broadly, you might describe it as a sort of a naturalistic approach. You're always learning. You want to ask questions. You are using evidence and reason, but where that leads you to is not a sort of strictly scientific understanding of the world. There is still space for a rich sense of awe and wonder and connectedness, that Spinozan sense of the beyond. But that transcendence or that thing beyond isn't, like some all-powerful conscious being, an old man in the sky with a beard doing stuff. It's more a sense of a connectedness with the universe. Does that roughly feel right? So,
absolutely, naturalism and supernaturalism are combined.
Yeah.
I don't see a problem with that. Like great scientists, like Galileo, or you don't have to throw the babies out with the bathwater. There is value in each. There is truth in each. And it's up to us to find where that truth lies.
Yeah. And I find that one of the really interesting things is I quite like to separate out the list of stuff we believe from the methods we use. And if you focus on the methods being evidence and reason, and you think about in a very broad sense, right? It's not just scientific controlled trials. It's about our experiences as well, and our life courses and our history and our socialization. If you think about it in that broad sense, it does leave the door open for even a naturalistic epistemology to recognize the possibility of the supernatural, right? Some people might challenge that and say, as soon as we have evidence of something, it can't be supernatural anymore. But I think, there has to be that humility in that space. And as long as we're always asking questions and open and willing to change our minds, and we're not trapped in something fixed, you can absolutely, I think many people find that space for still some sense of the transcendent and maybe the supernatural, even within a naturalistic worldview. It's interesting.
Well, absolutely. Well, it's like with the social scientists with Carl Jung. He believed in the spirit, and he considered it a psychological reality, not just a religious concept. So obviously within the sciences, the natural sciences, he believed in spiritual interconnectedness, and that the idea that we're all connected to something that was greater than ourselves. So even within that, there is acknowledgement within the social sciences of the reality psychologically of the spirit. So that was really interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, let's come on to the second of these big questions, the what matters and the who matters questions. And maybe I'll let you carry on, Michelle, because you'd already queued up how that sense of sort of Catholic dominion over non-humans had a role. I'd imagine, did that also have an influence on how you thought about other humans too around the world? Because I guess this question generally about who matters is, again, growing up as a kid, we think about caring about family and friends, of course, intuitively, but then over time, maybe that moral scope expands. So where did you start with your moral scope and those ideas of a dominion? How did that change with thinking about other humans as you got interested in human rights and broadening that perspective? And then, of course, there's your road to Damascus moment with thinking even beyond the human. What was that journey like?
Yeah. Well, it was amazing, really. And it didn't start till I was 50. I think it's Tom Reagan said, there's three kinds of ways of getting to animal advocacy. There's your Da Vincian. So those are those kids at 5-year-olds can go, is this an animal? I'm not eating it. Not me, sadly. The road to Damascus moment, he describes it, which is when something happens and the scales lift from your eyes and you get it. And the third one is obviously through evidence and reason. And that was his road, that through evidence and reading and understanding. For me, it was, don't want to go too much into it, but an amazing experience. It's been the most profound one of my life. I moved into this area in Cheshire, which is, rural. And so for the first time, I'd be traveling home and there'd be rabbits, roadkill. And I'd get out of the car, and my husband, bless him, and we'd move these animals to the side, put flowers. I'd do some weeping and, get home, make dinner, look after all my 7 rescue animals, but then, cook a meal with meat. Never thought of anything. But one day I moved the animal and it was beautifully intact, but dead, this beautiful rabbit. Got back home, opened the fridge. The light came on onto the chicken fillets I was about to eat. And I thought, what the am I doing? How come I've just been crying and weeping and I'm just about, that same flesh, I'm just about to put in my mouth and then maybe I think people have planted the seeds throughout my life, and I've met some amazing people that used to go, oh, you love animals, yet you eat them. And I think, yeah, what's the problem?
And it's bizarre, isn't it? Because that compassion was already there, right? You clearly felt, right? When you felt for the rabbit lying by the side of the road, more than most humans. Most humans would drive past without much of a thought, right? It's like the raw material of the compassion was there.
Weeping and wailing. I mean, it's embarrassing. And I always have. I've always been compassionate about animals. I couldn't watch the Black Beauty advert that used to be on television without crying. And so I was such an emotional, empathetic person, but there was this disconnect. But it's like I was a sleeping seed that had suddenly woken up. I don't know. It's like somebody had activated me. And I thought, what? And then from that moment, it was vegetarian. And then when I learned about the horrors of the egg and dairy and fish industries, that was it, vegan.
Just like that.
Just like the click of a light.
So that's fascinating psychologically. And what did it feel like socially, right? Because we're living in a world that thinks very differently, and even interested to know what your husband and your family and your friends thought. What were those transitions like?
Well, in a funny sort of world, it was like, this is hell, nor am I out of it. The dystopian view of the world, when all of a sudden you've been a participant in this, and ignorance isn't a defense, almost. And
it's understandable, but yeah.
Understandable. And, you can't beat yourself up about things, and I don't. But yes, there was some social pushback, but my God, the rewards have been so much greater. My husband's vegan, several members of my family now, and not because of, pushing the agenda on them or anything else. They joined the dots themselves. So at first when I was a vegetarian vegan, I'd cook meat for my hubby. And, because there's just two of us at home, still cook meat for my family. I don't do that now so much. I find alternatives, and they're happy with that. And they're equally compassionate for my choices. Sorry, Heather, I'm going on here, but, I go to their home and all of them are eating vegan, compassion and respect for me. And I, try and do the same likewise. So it's the best thing I've ever done.
Yeah, thank you.
The best. And as you're saying, compassion begets compassion. I started with humans, and, I've worked in nursing homes. I've always been helping. I've never been interested in a career for profit or gain. It's always like to help in some way. I think I'm a rescuer. If I, seems to be my way. But then when the animals, my God, and then as you live the vegan lifestyle, I think compassion begets compassion. And I've nearly killed myself letting a fly out of a window, because everything seems to matter. And even the plants, I know, the biocentric perspectives and everything else, but they do everything, that respect for life, that beauty of it. Why harm? If you don't have to harm it, why harm anything? Is kind of my.
And did the, if you like, the non-human animal question feel like a separate topic where the light went on, or did it plug into your existing thinking about human rights? Did they sort of become one question and one topic?
Well, I think because it had been so human-centric, when the animals came in, initially the focus was, oh my God, and then understanding the interconnections between, human injustice, social injustice for animals and social injustice, the mirroring of it all. It was all part of the same problem, all part of the same joy, also part of the same tragedy, really. So it just, I focused on one, then I looked at another, then I realized that they're two halves of the same whole, and taking a holistic approach to the injustices of the world. They are interrelated, all of the inequalities in life includes the animals and species and everything else. So yeah, it was a life in two halves and then together. And that's the way I go now. So, for example, I'll do as much for humans. I teach peace education with the Quakers. I attend Palestinian marches, so I still do my work for humans just the same as for animals, because we are all animals.
Yeah. Thank you. Heather, how about you?
I mean, for me, my family would probably describe it as a bit quite oversensitive. So I am quite a sensitive person, and I am someone that gets upset about stuff quite easily. So I think that there is that level of compassion or empathy that I have. But for me, I went from eating everything to being vegan. So it was an overnight thing. So my sister was a vegan probably about 18 months, 2 years. And she said to me, just do veganuary about 8 or 9 years ago. She was like, do veganuary, see how it goes. And I was like, oh, okay. So, and I'm a younger sister. So sometimes I'm just quite happy to be told what to do by an older sister. It's just the way it goes. And so I was like, all right. And then there was literally no going back then. So I ate meat up until like the 31st, or I was omnivore until kind of 31st of December. And then 1st of January came, and then that was it. I never went back. I can't tell you why that month made such a difference.
And before then, even as when you were younger as a kid, what was your relationship with non-human animals? Was that part of your felt empathy and connection?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we had like rescued cats while I was growing up. But if I'm honest, I don't think I ever really reflected on it, if that makes sense. I don't think it was ever in my kind of frame of reference, in a sense of working out how I felt about animals. The cats were around. That was great. Yeah, it's really difficult for me to kind of say that I was an overly kind of compassionate person with animals and that kind of stuff. I think I'd be kind of almost lying if I said that was the case. I think I just kind of battled my way through life. And I think I do have a greater interest I had traditionally a very great interest in people. And so wanting to protect people and look after people, and that was quite important. So I wonder if animals just kind of got a bit sidelined through that.
Yeah. And in the lead up to veganuary, was veganism something you'd considered or wrestled with, or were working through? Or was it something you deliberately avoided until the challenge from your sister? Because it sometimes seems to me that humans have got some quite amazing cognitive abilities, but it seems that we assign quite a high percentage of them to justifying doing what we want to keep doing. What sort of toolkit did you use there?
I think the cognitive dissonance was strong in that sense. I think I was very good at justifying why I had to eat meat, and and
so you did actually think it through. You were working to justify it. You weren't just sidestepping.
Yeah, I think I probably was but out of awareness, if that makes sense. Like, it's really difficult to say, because my sister turned vegetarian. She was 11, and then became vegan sometime after. I've always been aware of the fact that why she didn't eat meat. So having someone that never ate meat,
it's always in the back of your mind.
Yeah, and I suppose in a way,
I had a younger sister who led the way actually as well. So.
And sometimes there's also a little bit of like, well, she's a bit weird, she can do that. Like, and I'm not going to be like her. And, and I just wonder if that kind of played into it a little bit as well. I wanted to be different to my sister, so I would eat meat, or I'd like the kind of conflict that maybe, invoked when we were kind of both living at home.
Yeah, in those stages of life, there's you're drawn to oppose necessarily, not necessarily follow.
Yeah. But I suppose I have always liked animals. I suppose, I wouldn't go out. I've never gone out of my way to kind of harm an animal. Not many people have, but it's a really strange journey, because most vegans that you speak to have always had a compassion for animals. And I wonder if it's always been there, but I've never I couldn't say it was always kind of really explicit, if that makes sense.
And I quite like the way Michelle put it on, because I've interviewed here just a really interesting range of people. And there are some people who really had that deep felt emotional connection with non-human animals right from the start. There are other people it was a dawning realization. As Michelle said, there are other people who were just rationally thinking it through. And there's quite a few people now who are absolutely committed vegans who still don't actually, they're like, I'm not really an animal person. I don't really feel much. If I look into the eyes of a puppy, I'm like, well, I guess it's sort of cute. But, so some people take a, really emotional route, and other people are more intellectual. So it's fascinating, that range, isn't it? Yeah.
And I'm probably in the middle there. I've got kind of dogs myself. I've got a cat myself, and they're really important to me. But yeah, I don't think I'm at the extreme. I think I'm in the middle of that, if that makes sense, really.
Yeah. And what did it feel like when your sister challenged you to do veganuary and you did it? What was the turning point on day one when you I realized I can actually do this? Or was it at the end of the month when you looked back and thought, what was that transition like for you?
I think it was the beginning of the month when I was like, actually, and being vegan 8 or 9 years ago wasn't as easy as it is now. So being vegan now is it's not easy, has its moments, but it's pretty, it's significantly easier than it was.
Yeah, where we live anyway, yeah.
Yeah, 100%. And so, but I think there was a realization that actually I could cause less suffering in the world. And this veganism is almost the easiest decision that you can make if you want to cause less suffering in the world. Veganism is the best way of doing that, if that makes sense. And so I think it was pretty early on. But I found that veganuary was really easy, in a sense of I said to my friends, I'm going to do veganuary, and they were, okay, yeah, whatever. It was such a big thing. It's quite a big thing now. But 8 years ago, it was still a kind of a bit of a minority kind of month as well. So, but my friends just kind of accepted that I was doing that. And then because I never went back, it wasn't too much of a shock for them, if that makes sense, because there was a bit of bleeding for them. But I've never had the conversation around. I remember my friend saying to me, I didn't think you'd stick at it. She said to me, I thought you somewhere would eat bacon or do something and actually, yeah, I wonder what kind of impression I was creating around myself around that.
Yeah. And how did it feel emotionally for you? Did it feel like I'm making this enormous sacrifice, but I feel good because I'm making a sacrifice? Was it like a joy or a freeing? Was it, what did it feel like emotionally as you went through that?
I think it goes back into what Michelle said. It was possibly the best, most empowering decision I've ever made. And it's empowered me in ways that I didn't think that it could. So the fact that I know that I can live in a world where compassion reigns, where I do my best to not cause suffering. And I'm not perfect. I drive a lot. I'm not a perfect person, and I wouldn't claim to be, but I do my best to create a much more compassionate world. And that's really empowering, being able to make that decision. And I think the biggest thing for me is also just being a mirror to those around me as well. There's no one that I can claim that I particularly turned vegan in a sense, but I have conversations all the time. My friend's got a 5-year-old little girl, and we talk about it a lot, and she'll say, oh, can you eat this? Can you eat that? Why can't you eat this? Why can't you eat that? And, those kind of conversations are really important. And I just feel like being that kind of, person is really important within. And I think I'm lucky because I was already in academia. It extended into my academic career really nicely. And being in RE meant that there was already good crossover between being vegan and my kind of career choice as well. So it almost was like the stars aligned, and I could, see a way. My sister's much more overt vegan. She'll talk to people about it. She's quite overt, whereas I'm much more, I suppose, more passive aggressive. I'll do it for academia. I'll do it through, I'm not, probably not as overt as in that sense.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. There's a bunch of other stuff I could go into here, but because I'm also interested in how you think about some of the non-human animals that aren't under human control. So some of the deep, challenges of wild animal suffering. How do we think about that? But also the boundaries of the term animal and the term sentience. Could artificial intelligences one day be sentient, or as you were saying earlier on, Michelle, should we also have some form of respect for plants or the ecosphere or the environment in an intrinsic sense as well? Having queued that up, I'm really worried I could talk to you about that for an hour, and I really want to spend more time on the how do we make a better world and your work in the education space. But is there anything in there that you particularly wanted to mention or call out around these sort of broader cases or the fuzzy edges of the animal and the sentient, and how we should think about that stuff before we move on?
Could I ask, do you see any limits in the definition of sentientism as when it comes to the experience of animals? And is it at all human-centric that we're almost deciding what's the value of a life, when it can have its own intrinsic values that we don't even understand?
Yeah.
That are we in danger of being sort of anthropocentric using the term?
There's absolutely that, I think, that danger. And in a way, there's a pure sense in which we can't escape it because we are human. So we are always going to be speaking from a human perspective. And there's a danger that we might say, well, the reason sentience is important, this capacity to feel and experience, is because we humans have it. So now let's work out who else might have it. And if they're like us, the more like us they are, the more important they are, right? And that is a really dangerous pattern of thinking. And it's a dangerous pattern of thinking in human ethics as it is for, I think, non-humans. So I think we have to be very alive to that risk and aware of that risk. And I guess the way I counter it is that, to my mind, focusing on sentience in a naturalistic context explicitly denies focusing on the human, because sentience as a biological phenomenon, as a psychological phenomenon, as an ability to have a perspective, to have interest, to care about anything at all, predates humans by maybe 500-600 million years. And even today, if you think about the number of sentient beings on our planet, it's uncountable, but it's probably in the quadrillions or the quintillions, and us humans are a tiny, vanishingly small percentage of that number. So I think if we genuinely have a concern for sentience and sentient beings, it radically decenters the humans, because we're sentient beings, but we're a very late coming type of sentient, and we're a tiny proportion of them. And also built into this idea of sentience is the fact that a sentient being has their own interests and their perspectives. It's not about us judging from outside. It's about respecting what their values and their interests and their perspectives are. Now, the challenge is as in with human ethics, we can never know perfectly, right? I can never know exactly what it's like to be Michelle and how to help you, but at least I can make a good faith attempt at understanding your interests, what you care about, what you want, your perspective. And if I want to claim to be moral, then I should try and act with, that in mind. And I think that carries through to the non-human sphere as well. So I think if we do it, those are real dangers, but if we do it right, focusing on sentience decenters the human in a very radical way and forces us to have the best possible good faith appreciation of what it might like to be someone else, human or not. But it's an important challenge and an important risk.
Yeah, because I do find it interesting, sort of, because obviously it's based on evidence and then reason. So
Yeah.
Evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. I just remind myself. But sometimes I don't quite understand with looking at, which is a nice moral exercise, what if there's aliens from outer space or AI is sentient? You spend time talking about, well, if they are, this is what we'd do. What happens if there's an entity of nature, a creator, that's also sentient, that is, part of my spiritual existence? How come they can't be discussed, but where we've got no evidence for?
Yeah, I think any being that is sentient should matter, regardless of their species, their substrate, whatever they are. So that would extend to including, some sort of form of supernatural being. If angels really exist, then and they're sentient, then they should matter. I guess two things about the evidence and reason thing. One is I think we should be radically open-minded, right, to even ideas that seem strange to us. So never say never, never say 0%, but have some skepticism. But I do think that if there isn't evidence, decent evidence for something, I don't think there's a good reason to believe it. So I wouldn't put much effort into worrying about what an angel wants, because I don't think they exist. And I think the evidence and reason thing can also be another protection against us humans being self-serving. It's never perfect because, like you say, science makes mistakes as well, right? Although it's supposed to self-correct. But Descartes is a really interesting example, right, where he essentially said, he might have said, look, I care about all suffering matters, but because dogs don't have souls, they're not ensouled, they cannot feel anything. And I would say, well, because he wasn't grounding his beliefs in evidence and reason, he was using a sort of supernatural dogma that just insisted only humans mattered, that left the dogs and all other non-humans as potential victims because he could disregard their suffering. Whereas if you take a broadly scientific approach, I mean, frankly, you can't do that. I mean, you can't be a decent scientist who looks at the evidence and deny the sentience of, Luna the puppy downstairs. So I almost see the evidence and reason thing, hopefully, as a protection against the arbitrariness of human oppression. It can be a bit of a bulwark to defend us, because I can put my hand up and say, look, here is the evidence that I am a feeling being. So I demand respect and rights and compassion. But
I think that's sometimes I twitch at the word reason, for that very reason. The Aristotle, the Aquinas, we have reason, animals don't.
That's absolutely critically important, is that the compassion is for the sentient beings and the sentient. Their rationality is totally irrelevant under sentientism. So the evidence and reason bit is purely about how do we understand this world with humility, changing our minds as the evidence changes, always asking questions, never getting stuck in dogma. That's just about how we understand the world. But using evidence and reason is not relevant to our moral patiency, whether we matter. There, the only thing matters. The only thing matters is sentience, which is why a human infant matters, even though they're not particularly rational, which is why, Luna the puppy downstairs, some mixed rationality, depending on what sort of mood she's in, right? Doesn't matter. Don't care whether Luna is rational. She is sentient. That's what matters. So the only moral aspect is driven through sentience. It's completely irrelevant. Rationality, intelligence, looks, species, caste, the list goes on, right? All of those things are morally irrelevant. The only thing matters is, if you have a decent chance of being sentient, you matter, and you matter deeply. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think one of the problems for me is the scientific tick box. If it's proven scientifically, it's okay. Plato, just as you've got those philosophers and scientists that denounce, human sentience or capacity to feel reason, you had others that didn't. And in my own experience, I didn't need the Cambridge, declaration to know that all of my animals are sentient, loving, empathetic beings.
Yeah.
And
I completely agree.
Sometimes my problem, that unless it's scientifically proven. And what does sentience mean when we have an act in law that recognizes animal sentience? But what does it achieve? You know what I mean? For me, that evidence or moral standing has to be acted out in reality. If the evidence, say, for a sentience is there, the evidence that, let's say, plant-based diets are better for animals, humans, and the planet, there's your evidence. Scientific. Reason, well, you follow the evidence. And compassion for all beings, you don't hurt animals.
Yeah.
De facto, then, shouldn't the default position of every sentience be vegan?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, of course.
But it isn't. How do you square that circle?
So I'll come back to the reason I talk about evidence and reason rather than science is because there is a danger that we think too narrowly about a scientific worldview. So there's randomized control trials and there's people in white lab coats doing experiments, right? That is science, and it's a formal way of doing evidence and reasoning, but it's only part of it. I think our life experiences, the use of our senses, looking into the eyes of a puppy, those are types of evidence too, and they matter. So that's why I think of it in this very broad sense. And it has to have humility and doubt and open-mindedness at its heart. It can't be, I've done a randomized control trial, here's the answer, and now I have my own scientific dogma, right? It has to be anti-dogmatic. I totally agree with your point that there's no point having a moral stance or expressing compassion if you don't put that into practice. And in a way, that's the dark heart of the problem we're all facing, and that most humans do actually say they care, but we in our systems don't act that way. And so I think because veganism is a practical philosophical stance against, the exploitation, commodification, harming, killing of non-human animals, sentient non-human animals, it's an obvious 100% locked in implication of having a sentientist worldview. So if someone says, I'm a sentientist and I use evidence and reason to understand the world and I have compassion for all sentient beings, but they haven't taken that step, it's because of their own cognitive dissonance. In the same way as, we have many humans around the world. Now, I'd hope it's still a positive step, because by them claiming this position, they're starting to recognize a problem, at least. But so I guess that's how I'd frame it. I mean, there are people who say they're vegans who don't boycott all animal products, right? And we would have the same conversation with them, right? Here are your stated values, here are your behaviors. Well, okay, let's talk that through. And in fact, that's a large amount of what fiery vegan Twitter debate is doing every day.
Yeah.
I'm not sure much of it's productive, but there's some really interesting challenges. Thank you.
Yeah, but I think with veganism, if somebody says I eat animals and I'm a vegan, you could challenge it. And certainly if you took that person to wanted to make out a case of discrimination in court and said, I'm an ethical vegan and I eat animals, it wouldn't get past the
Completely agree.
Because I was just basically thinking it would be wonderful if a sentientism did have a moral baseline, and that, I think with a clearer definition, obviously you're objective and, opening and pluralistic, that for belief and action to be combined, moral and acting on knowledge, that, for me, it's always important that, it acts out in the real world and isn't just a theoretical or philosophical exercise.
I agree. And I think one of the things you've helped me work through as I've been working on this project is recognizing that setting a practical moral baseline is really important, because it's so easy, for our human minds to say things we want to say to feel good, but not to actually carry that through into action. And setting a specific baseline can be really powerful in holding ourselves to account in doing that. So the way I framed that in Sentientism today, and we've just been emphasizing this more and more over recent years, is to be clear about what we mean by a minimal requirement of having compassion for someone. So the headline is evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. But I think it's really important to be very clear. What do we mean by the minimum for the word compassion to retain its meaning, right? What is the minimum? So if someone was to ask me, Jamie, right, what's the minimum you'd expect? If I say I'm being compassionate to you, Jamie, or I care about you, or I want to treat you with respect, or I want to treat you humanely, what's the absolute minimum I would expect from that person? And the baseline we've suggested is technically called non-maleficence, which is basically just, not exploiting, harming, or killing someone without a really strong overriding justification, right? Which echoes what's already in veganism in the as far as practicable and possible. If someone's in a genuine survival situation, there are always edge cases, right? So in a way, we've suggested that non-maleficence is the minimal moral baseline, which in the field of human exploitation animals is veganism. That's the minimum moral baseline. And then hopefully we go beyond that, right? We go into benevolence and helping and supporting and assisting. But the absolute baseline is we do what we reasonably can not to exploit, harm, or kill, which leads directly into veganism. And it has that sort of negative stance of, avoiding doing this thing, which leads into things like the vegan boycott. But it also, compassion has this broader concept of helping and benevolence and going beyond as well. But I think you're absolutely right that setting that baseline is really important. And sometimes that's the dynamic we find as people get engaged with this sentientism idea. They read evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings, and they go, yeah, that sounds great. Tell me more. And once they've committed to that headline, then you can start to draw them into thinking about, okay, what should compassion mean practically? Not just for those around us, but for the sentient beings we engage with through different systems. And then we have to insist on that moral baseline. So I think you make a really important point. And in a way, that's more important than the theory. The theory is connecting it to the real world, because I think most people already agree with us in theory. The challenge is the human psychology and the sociology and the systems and the political will that stops us, taking that theoretical compassion and actually acting on it. So I think that's the dark part of the problem, isn't it? Which maybe is a good way of framing how we come into the final big question about how do we make a better world, because in a way that's exactly what you two are trying to do, is to try and address and close that gap. So on this final question, in the time I've got left with you, the idea roughly is, right, we've got this rough way of understanding reality, hopefully with humility and open-mindedness and curiosity. And we've now got this confidence that non-human animals, human animals, all sentient beings matter and should matter seriously. So what the hell do we do about it? So this is the final question. How do we make a better world? And if you do have any sort of grand utopian visions about where humanity, and maybe even sentientity could get to, that might be an interesting way to start. But I also wanted to drill into your work in the education space, of course. So Heather, I don't know if you wanted to start with, if you've got a grand utopian vision, great. But also, how do you think about, the education space broadly, and how we can make that more of a force for good and less of a force for bad?
Yeah, I think the education space is problematic, I think, because it's so political, and it's a political hot potato, and it's a really easy political football to kick around. So whoever's in power likes to get their teeth into education and likes the education to reflect their particular stance. So
is that partly because they realize how important it is, how foundationally important it is?
100%. But the thing is that we make small gains, but then we have a change of government, we have a change of education secretary, and things change again. And I think my experience of education over the last about 20 years, I've been teaching education. It's just not a stable enough space to really implement the change that I perhaps felt I could when I first trained to be a teacher. So, and I experienced it with my trainee teachers. So why do you want to be a teacher? Oh, I want to change the world. Brilliant. But they realized by December, January, February, that a lot of it is marking, is meetings, it's firefighting. And so I think education, it's easy to kind of think that education is a space where the world can change. And I do believe it can. And I think there's certain spaces, particularly in subjects like RE, PSHE, citizenship, those kind of subjects that are more non-statutory and more to do with the developing of the person, are good spaces to introduce conversations around animals, animal welfare, sentientism, that kind of stuff. But I think I've had to learn to really manage my expectations about how change can happen. So when I started out on my doctorate, my hypothesis was that these young vegans were really changing the worlds that they lived in. As I got through my research, what I realized is that they have very little opportunity to do that. They come up against the hidden curriculum. They come up against schools that aren't willing to meet their dietary preferences. They come up against prejudice, not just from peers, but from teachers. And so I really had to chat. So my focus, my dissertation changed to narrating their experiences rather than seeing them as change makers. Now, they will be change makers. They will influence their peers. I think I felt like it was an easier thing to do in education than it really is. So I don't know if that kind of answers the question really, but
it does, yeah, because it talks about the sort of wider context, the nature of the curriculum itself, the pressure and challenges on teaching, but also then the experiences of, in this case, vegan kids going through that world and what that feels like for them. Yeah.
Teachers are tied by curriculum and tied by GCSE specifications, A-level specifications, needing the best outcomes. It's a meritocracy. And I feel like whilst education is a meritocracy, there's limited scope for change. Having said that, I don't feel like the picture is as massively bleak as that, in a sense of I think we can still have conversations. I've got a great teacher. So I'm still based in Liverpool. I've got a great teacher who works in L8, in Toxteth in Liverpool, at a fairly kind of very mixed ability school. She's done a philosophy club. And I've gone in and talked to the children about veganism. She's had all sorts of people come in and talking about their worldviews. And for these young people that won't necessarily get those alternative voices, that's a really important space for them to discuss these things, to think about these issues. So education has pockets of opportunity. And I think what has inspired me about kind of Michelle and yourself and other people that are in these spaces is that we are looking at those opportunities and seizing them and thinking, actually, where can we make the difference? We're not going to be able to fight the dairy industry in terms of offering milk on the canteen, in the canteen. I feel like, but what we can do is have those conversations around why milk might not be the best thing to be drinking. And, but having said that, I have also experienced parental pressure as well. So schools are scared of parents, they're scared of the community, and not in a bad way, but they are there to serve their community. So they get very concerned if the narrative is taken by a parent and not agreed with, or they're criticizing a particular narrative. And so schools sometimes can be quite conservative as well. So, but that paints a really bleak picture, and it's not as bleak as that. But I think for me, it's the realism of education. It's a great space. I'm a real socialist when it comes to education, so I very much believe in statement education. What's interesting about the independent sector is there's more opportunity in the independent sector because they are not so constrained, and so they have much more. They, in my opinion, they have the time and the resources to do critical thinking much better and that kind of stuff. So, and so that can be a real conflict for me about where I stand and, what I promote as well.
Yeah, it's tricky. And I think, both Michelle's work with Vine and your work in general wants to see a vegan worldview and a vegan ethic infused through every aspect of the school. So it's not just in a particular curriculum topic, it's in all of them. And it's not just in the curriculum, it's in the way the kids are treated and enabled. And it is in the canteen, and it is in what school trips you'll get on. So you see that in quite a rich way, which I think is very powerful because it should infuse all of those things. It's not like an optional extra topic that should be added on, right? Ethics and value should run through everything. But at the same time, like you say, there's some really interesting points of opportunity. And you talked about citizenship, PSHE. And again, this is for my global audience. This is in a UK context, but I think it plays out. But one of the areas I've found fascinating that both of you work a lot in is religious education, sometimes being called religion and worldviews education, or religion and values these days as well. And I wonder if that might be interesting to zero in on as a particular use case. And I don't know which of you would you like to give our listeners and viewers a sort of quick intro to how does religious education work in the UK, and how has it been changing, and why is it an interesting space it's one of those rare places in the curriculum where you can talk about ethics and values, I guess.
I think the interesting thing about RE is it's always on a journey. So I talk about schools being political. RE can be a tiny bit political as well, although less so. But when I started 20 years ago, we basically just taught the 6 major world religions. And that was pretty much it. And so you would say Christians go to church on a Sunday, blah, 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 blah. And then we introduced much more philosophy and ethics. And that came through some structural changes at GCSE. So that gave us an opportunity to look at things like animal testing, abortion, all of those kind of things, afterlife, and to explore them in a much more philosophical lens, rather than just saying to a group of year 11s, Jewish people celebrate Passover. We're beginning to think about, well, if a Jewish person celebrates Passover, how might they feel about the sacrifice of animals, for example? So it allowed us to take the conversation a bit further. The previous government took out philosophy and ethics. at the GCSE, so we kind of lost that. But what the RE world has in response to that is brought in a worldview agenda. So this idea that nobody, and I really like it, it's a really lovely video, but it says nobody stands nowhere. And this idea that we all have a way of seeing the world. And that RE is a way of us understanding our own worldviews, but also that worldview isn't just religion. It could be Sentientism, it could be veganism, it could be all sorts of different things. And I've really liked that change. It's probably happened over the last 5 years. Wales have very much taken it on, and it's very much within their curriculum. The UK and Scotland have been a bit slower. We're waiting for the curriculum reforms to come out and that debate is ongoing. But in most, so I train teachers, but I visit schools and watch them teach. And this idea of worldviews is very much coming through. So, we're exploring stuff rather than seeing them as empty vessels to fill up. We're allowing them to develop their ideas. So that's where RE is now.
And I find it's again, I'm learning all the time, but I find it fascinating because it's more open-minded, it's less monolithic, it's recognizing that there are differences between worldviews, but there are really productive areas of overlap, that there are underlying themes, and that there's a massive diversity within each worldview as well. There's no such thing as
Absolutely.
a Muslim and everybody is the same, right? There's that diversity. So I really like that. And I also have been encouraged. There's a bit of self-selection with the people in the RE world I've engaged with, of course. But many of them genuinely do seem to have as objectives, we want kids to come out of our RE courses with their own critical thinking skills, with a deep appreciation of the value of other people's worldviews so we can live together in a multi-worldview, multicultural society, and actually also with the confidence to explore and examine and maybe even change their own worldview, which often is not a trivial thing to do in modern society or with families as well. So there is that really sort of progressive, child-centered, we really want to help them find their own way, which I've found really encouraging. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. And we call it, there's the concept of confessional RE. And confessional RE is RE that was traditional and we developed to make children Christian. And that was the whole idea. And of course, we've left that quite far behind now. And even, I say even, I don't mean it in a disparaging way, but even some of the Catholic and C of E schools that I will go into are taking on this idea of worldviews and recognizing that the children that they teach and moving away from Michelle's idea of Catholicism and how that might have been taught and developing their thinking around stuff, talking about the former Pope and his stance on ecological issues. And, so yeah, I think it's I think you're spot on. I think it's the development of that sense of self. And I think that's why, for me, RE is a good place to be discussing Sentientism, veganism. And that's something I will kind of probably keep kind of banging on about as well.
Absolutely. Keep banging on. Yeah.
And Michelle, because I've talked for quite a while.
Yeah. And Michelle, I was in that context. Maybe it would be good to drill into the work of Vine specifically. How do you engage with that space? How do things work practically in the classroom? And I think there's a few different challenges, some of which Heather mentioned already, and opportunities. One is, how does veganism as a worldview and a way of thinking intersect and relate to other worldviews, religious and not? And that's another thing my mind has been blown by exploring those intersections. So how does it link with other types of worldviews and what are those synergies like? But I guess I'm also interested in how do you handle the difficulties here? Because as you mentioned already, Heather, this is a socially very contentious topic, right? You can imagine young kids coming out of the classroom, going home and sitting around at the family dinner table and having some quite difficult conversations and finding themselves on the front line of a super contentious issue. And so how do you navigate that in the work with Vine? I mean, to be honest, if anyone's good at handling really sensitive topics in a engaging way with the kids, it's got to be religious education teachers, right? Because they're already dealing with deeply contentious, emotionally salient. So we're just adding another one to the list, right? So
Yeah, just another one to the list. Well, obviously, veganism is, as defined in 1944 by Donald Watson, is a strictly secular belief, and it was founded on the science of its day.
And that's secular, not in the sense of rejecting religion, but being independent from religion, or
Independent from religion. In fact, they didn't want.
so it can be
Donald
either.
Watson,
Yeah.
Yeah. Didn't want to have it sort of have a religious connotation, or, sort of a hippie kind of, before the hippies. They wanted it to be founded on the science of the day. That was it. But the thing is, what's beautiful about veganism is it's, as you know, its roots are ancient, both in religious and non-religious worldviews. Veganism, ahimsa, everything, Plato. It was a new term, and I think for legal reasons, it's good to have this sectioned out, certainly for the UK courts, but to understand that it brings together everybody. It doesn't matter if you have a faith or no faith. If your destination is the same, compassion, then that's sort of all that matters. So yeah, and yeah, I think with everything, it's how you introduce it.
Have you come across any worldviews that, or people interpreting worldviews that explicitly reject it and use their worldview to reject it? Because I obviously have this sort of more progressive stance where I could look at any religion, obviously the Dharmic religions, or Christianity, where the Garden of Eden was vegan, or in Islam, where there's rich ideas of compassion and mafsada and other concepts which speak about compassion beyond the human, right? So I will always look for those stories. Do you find much experience in people using their own worldview to, whether it's religious or not, to explicitly push back as a form of rejection, or can you always find an intersection?
Well, for those who are drawn to veganism, so for example, for some people, the veganism isn't because of Donald Watson. It's their interpretation of the holy text, be it, the Torah or the Bible. They see that as their, religious duty, not because it's a secular duty, and they're tagging it on. Their reason isn't, the vegan society. It's their belief and how they understand the world. So you'll always get the people who justify atrocities by saying, well, it's written down that we can dominate. But actually, when you start to study and you look at virtually every tenet of every world religion is based on compassion. And it's quite often when the basic faith becomes contaminated by human beings, like the Chinese whispers, like the Aquinas, who animals don't have souls, dogmatically, no reason. They're there for our use. Dominion meant domination, not stewardship or flourishing. So yeah, of course. But I think we have to look for compassion and bring those together who feel that way. And that's certainly in veganism within RE is something that I think is great for kids to see, that you can have a worldview. I mean, there's the Catholic Vegan Society, there's the Muslim Vegan Society, there's the Jains that are vegan. It's a choice that is open to them, and I think is the ultimate end goal of most religions, is living in peace together, compassionately, whether you believe in a creation or not. So
yeah, it can run through them all. Yeah, how do you handle those challenging social contexts where, awkward conversations around the dinner table, or even, Heather was talking about some of the schools themselves sort of pushing back or challenging or being nervous about engaging with this topic. How does Vine work through and navigate those challenges?
I often think, when children attend a class and say they're Catholic and the lesson is on the Muslim faith, does anyone go, I'm worried that when Johnny gets home, he's going to want to be a Muslim?
It's like a similar thing, isn't it? It's a similar sort of concern, right?
Yeah. And for as well, I wouldn't want to traumatize children because they're not economic agents. The thing is, you're laying out the table of choices. This is about knowledge sharing. It's about critically and objective thinking. You're not telling children to be Muslim or Christian or vegan. It's what's in the world around you. They go into the shops, they can see plant-based food, they see it on the television. To be honest, they're most probably more clued up than the teachers and parents. So you're meeting them where they're already at. It's a reality that's age old. It's not a new propaganda. And yes, there's a lot of misconceptions about it, mainly because of the media or the fear of change or people not wanting to change their habits. But I think presented right and involving parents in any decision making, if there's anything any bigger, is the greatest way. I mean, I think ProVeg, for example, do great work in getting more plant-based food in schools by bringing everybody on board in the decision making, making everybody aware. I mean, there's a school near me and a nursery, that's gone completely plant-based, completely vegan. It's a sustainable school. And Cambridge had come in and done a research, and my God, the effect on carbon, just, we'd be reversing climate change if everyone adopted this school model. Not only that, but about compassion too, compassion for each other. It's not just about a diet. It's about sustainable caring for each other and the planet. So it works. And there's another vegan school down south. So, of course, most of these are independent schools because governments put a block on what can or can't be served. But even that's being overridden. So, and changing all the time. So, yeah, I think I'm hopeful for the future because there's change. Like, as you know, you and I work with Jigsaw on their, other organizations are interested in this as a concept. And that kind of helps to give it credence.
Yeah, it just normalizes it more and more.
Yeah, it's an academic subject, isn't it? It's not propaganda.
I was invited to a conference last week run by the Church of England and one of their dioceses, which was a conference for teachers, mostly in Church of England schools, not exclusively. But I was really encouraged because animal ethics and veganism wasn't just in my section, right? It was something that was mentioned in quite a few different sections. There was a humanist speaker who talked about non-human animal ethics, which is, encouraging. And there was also a session run by David Clough's C4 organization, which again is a sort of specifically Christian organization focused on farmed animal welfare, as an explicit focus of, the agenda on the day. So it was just infusing throughout. It wasn't just, the tag of vegan on the end, it was like it rippled through, which was really encouraging. But that C4 session led me to another question I wanted to explore with you about how do you handle this in the classroom? Because on the one hand, unthinkingly, children are normalized into animal product consumption, right? So regardless of the horrors that go on in the slaughterhouse, it's just default to put the products of those slaughterhouses in front of kids, tell them it's tasty and delicious and normal, and off they go, right? But one of the questions to my session was, how do you talk about this with younger children? Because it's focused on primary teachers. When, how much can we expose to them about the reality of things like animal agriculture and, testing and exploitation, right? Shouldn't we be sensitive and hold back from exposing that stuff to kids? And it's I'll ask you the question in a minute, but the reason it popped into my mind is because the C4 session was actually presented by a teacher who'd run an initiative in her own school. It wasn't presented by someone from the organization. It was presented by a teacher who'd done this really interesting work with a group of primary school kids where they had some backyard hens at the school that were not going to be farmed or slaughtered. I don't know where they came from, but they were backyard hens that they cared for. They went to visit some local farm, which was tiny scale. It had 9 hens and they were out in the backyard, except for when the bird flu restrictions kept them inside. And on the positive side, these kids genuinely were developing a really rich empathy and compassion for the chickens. They'd gone from seeing them as like objects of curiosity to really thinking what it might be like to be a chicken. They were writing lists of what makes a chicken's life happy. And then they were sending letters to farmers and even the caterers and saying, do you give chickens these things because they need companionship and dust baths and water and food? And it was sort of really, there was a genuine positive intervention there. But at the same time, because of this sensitivity about not wanting to freak the kids out or horrify them because they're young, there was no mention of what happens to the male chicks. There was no mention of slaughter processes. There was no mention of the genetic modification of these birds in the first place and how it made it very difficult for them to lead good lives, even if they were allowed out. So the negative aspects of these processes and these systems was just not really addressed in this session. And so I was left in this not knowing how to feel about this intervention because it felt positive on one hand, but on the other hand, it hid the very dark heart of the problem from these young kids. And that sort of felt a bit disrespectful. But at the same time, what can you show to a 7-year-old? Anyway, there's the question. I got there in the end. How do you cope with that?
For me, I think obviously any teaching is compassion. You have to be compassionate in your teaching. And I think for primary school, it's not necessary at that point. I think engaging empathy, appreciating that animals are sentient beings with their own lives, and is a good start. I think it's awful because obviously teachers, 90% of the time, they're saying, for example, eating meat is natural, normally, and necessary. Then all of a sudden there's this,
without hesitation,
a sideball of, and by the way, this, you don't have to. So that's a difficulty. But I think done compassionately, I think what you've done is right, because for me, it's engaging in stories, engaging in children appreciating their sentience and their alternatives. Because equally, so for example, you talk about there are about 118 now, I think, school farms where the children, even primary, are raising animals for slaughter. They have them for 6 months, like pigs, for 3. And, sometimes they're allowed to name them, sometimes not. And I'm thinking, whoa.
It's like there's massive programs in the States, isn't it? It's the farming community programs, 4-H or
the H programs. And I remember some of the kids, like there's a study by Lancaster University on the benefits of school farms, which even in their own, materials, you can see there's issues here, big issues. Is that they go, well, I think it's really mean, his children say that the pigs are killed, but what can I do? I like sausages. And you think, well, actually, there's an alternative to a meat sausage. So I think that those lessons need to be conducted pluralistically too. Just like we've got the onus on teaching veganism, objective, pluralistic. I'd like to point out on those others where it's a carnist agenda, that should be more pluralistic. Or the RSPCA in their compassionate education, again, they promote only animal welfare and meat eating. They don't include veganism. So I think it's challenging, even legally, those organizations that don't offer a more pluralistic perspectives on what we do. But I certainly think with young people, I wouldn't want to traumatize a child too early. That time will come. I think once they've understood animals and their sentience and a way of viewing them as our equal, that's the bedrock. That's the seeds you sow. And then when they are it's age relevant to introduce those topics, it'll be even more powerful because they've connected with nature, they've connected with the animal. And that time, I don't know what Heather thinks.
Yeah, I just think it's a tightrope. And we talk about, there's quite a lot of controversial issues that are discussed in RE. And I think it comes down to knowing your pupils and knowing your community. And if you can develop those relationships with them, then you can actually have more honest conversations with them. But I don't think there's like a sledgehammer approach to it. And I think, it really needs that nuance. And it's so hard because as a teacher, you're kind of master to you're kind of mastered by a number of different kind of puppeteers, and that's really difficult. So, I suppose when I talk to my teachers, although they're secondary, I talk to them about the fact that they can say, well, I don't think that slaughtering an animal is right, and these are my reasons, and we can explore that and we can talk about that, and just being open and having those conversations. But it is just giving them alternative voices, and I think that's what RE is really good at, is saying, well, actually, let's look at what might happen to these animals, and why might a vegan or vegetarian have an issue with that, and let's explore that. And you can do that through why might a Hindu, for example, and so sometimes not making it kind of too obvious. You kind of have to stick within the kind of more not approaches, if that makes sense,
and enable the kids to explore for themselves rather than
And actually just say, ask me questions, be open, like, it's fine. I'll be honest with you, but yeah. Sorry, Michelle.
Oh, no. I'm just agreeing with all of that. And I think as well, it's understanding that I think the empathy is already in there. What you're trying to do is be one of the blockers so that it's not socialized or educated out of them. When I look at some of the exhibits in the spirited arts competition, I think, my goodness, they already have that ethical heart, as well as good RE and the way it's being taught. There is already that compassion where they think about animal experimentation or slaughter, or they have that sense of social justice that's profound. I mean, I think we have a lot to learn from them, and I think that's the problem. We're not top down. How do we teach them? Because it's how we learn from them too. I think it's not just a one-way street. It's a mutual.
I love that, and there's so much hope there in that experience. Working with kids is such a privilege because, like you say, you feel they have that innate, deep felt compassion, and in a way, ending the bad aspects of education and taking those out is almost as important as doing good education, because you just need to free kids to express their own values in the world, right? And most of the time they'll go well with that. So yeah.
It's like you said, when I was a kid, I wouldn't dare challenge the school or think outside my box that I was put in. But when I look at that, there was one school farm and they did, got the student voice is really important. So the students did a survey of whether or not the pigs should be killed. And it was like 89% said, no, they shouldn't be. These are our friends. This is a betrayal of trust. And the school was shocked, but there was a school who'd already had this program, thinking it was great, thinking that the results were going to be, oh, yeah, it's great. We've got, sustainability. The pigs don't have to travel far before they go, because they're served in the canteen. But, and so the children had made themselves thinking that's not right, that's not fair, so
it's almost like
these days
removing the constraints to allow the kids to be who they already want to be. And you talked earlier on about, the constraints you felt about being brought up Catholic. Arguably the constraints we all feel about being brought up in a sort of carnist, speciesist world are even stronger and even more consistently applied, right? And if we can free kids' minds from those constraints, good, wonderful things can happen.
Yeah, because obviously it's complicated. It's a cultural thing, isn't it? Because when you it's not just changing, it's your social and cultural identity quite often. So it's not just a change of, of an ingredient. It's a change of nurturing or belief or celebration. It's complex, but worth doing.
Now I need to let you go, but if you've got a few more minutes, I had one more question. If you've got time for one more, although it's another crazily big one, but let's see if we can deal with it crisply enough to respect your time. How do you think education about veganism and compassion for non-human animals relates more broadly to how we treat each other as humans? It's an echo of what we talked about earlier on, but do you think that they relate and correlate in some way? Can they feed off each other? And I was prompted to talk about this partly because you wrote a recent blog, Heather, prompted by the Netflix series Adolescence, right, where you were talking about some of the other problems we're facing today in society and in the classroom around misogyny and the influence of social media and various other things. How do you think are there links between these different sorts of challenges in the education space? I don't know if you want to start.
I would say definitely the intersectionality is quite huge, and certainly it brings up issues about women and how we view women, certainly within the dairy industry. And that's a really interesting conversation to have. How do we view the female of the species? And actually, we don't really view our females in a much more different way, in a sense, So I feel like veganism unlocks a lot. And I think the vegans that I've met are generally, and it's going to sound a bit contrived, but it's generally on the right side of history in terms of their opinions about other things, because it just allows you to step back and think, well, what's the most compassionate response here? Who are the vulnerable people? Who are being exploited? Why are we exploiting them? Why do we think that's acceptable? And it just opens up that can of worms that, and it then can be quite difficult to get those worms back in, because you're like, oh, hadn't thought about that. And, oh yeah. So I really care about animals. So I'm not going to eat animals, but, actually I get really frustrated with my Muslim neighbor, and so, yeah, I think it just really opens up those conversations. I think it's a path to compassion that, yeah, can be really, really useful.
Yeah, thank you. If you're against one form of oppression, why not be against them all as you start to recognize them? Yeah, thank you.
I think I do find that quite frustrating because sometimes I feel like vegans have to almost have to stand for everything, if that makes sense. So sometimes I feel like quite a lot, I feel like sometimes it's a bit of a well, the vegans can, they're kind of dealing with that. Do you understand what I mean? So, I just feel like sometimes it would be good to share some of this between some of the other humans that exist in the world as well.
Completely. And I'm very open-minded about people choosing to focus their efforts on resisting one form of oppression versus the other, or putting into practice their solidarity with one group rather than the other. But however you choose to focus, that's not an excuse for perpetuating an oppression against any oppressed group, right? So the baseline still has to be there. The baseline you were talking about, Michelle, right? You wouldn't say I'm focusing on countering sexism, which is why it's okay for me to be racist, right? That makes no sense. You can focus on sexism, that's fine. But the minimum, you shouldn't be racist at the same time. And I think we should be able to demand the same thing, right? Fine. You don't have to be a full-time vegan activist. You can work on human rights, but you shouldn't be perpetuating oppressions, at least as a baseline. I don't know if you wanted to add on to anything else onto that, Michelle, before I let you go.
All kinds of oppression is there, like Tolstoy, while there'll be slaughterhouses, there'll be battlefields. I mean, there's loads of quotes from people that realize how we need to extend our circle of compassion. The Spites is sort of quote to all living beings. It's better for everybody. It's a win-win for humans and the animals. And in fact, you have to have both, because once you start to discriminate, that is racism, that is speciesism. If you can get rid of that or work to dissolve those differences, then it's healthier. And I think for change, as well as individual, we need, as Heather was saying, systemic change. It's no good just sort of like changing one philosophy for another as though an idea is going to fix it. When we've got problems like climate change and we acknowledge sentience, but animals still suffer horribly, it's because politically there's financial gain to it. And so we need to understand, as well as discussing ideas and knowledge and working individually, is how do we work on the economic and political structures for systemic change? I think that's important too.
Completely. And I think that's, we need vegan political systems and social systems and cultural norms and social norms, not just vegan individuals, right? I mean, obviously they go together, right? But it's that whole
to look at the big picture. And because obviously there is tipping points and an individual has the power to make a change. But let's look at the reality of how that change can be affected and how it would look. That's, what would the future look like, so.
Brilliant. Well, my work in classrooms gives me enormous hope, and talking to you too gives me enormous hope as well. So thank you so much for your amazing work. I'm looking forward to continuing to work together in whatever ways we can. But before we wrap up, how would you best suggest people follow you, keep up to date, support Vine? I don't know how much social media, but you both do. Do you want to go first, Michelle? And I'll put links in the show notes, so don't worry too much. But where would you point people?
Teachvine.org is the website. Teachvine on Instagram and LinkedIn. So all welcome, or email, equally, or hello@teachvine.
Great, thank you. And how about you, Heather?
Yeah, I suppose, I've got a profile on the Jagiellonian University website where I work. So, if you're interested in any of my academic kind of writing, I write about all sorts of things. So, I suppose at all intersections with veganism. So yeah, that's a good place to find me. And my email address is on there. So if people want to talk to me about anything, then feel free to contact me.
That's brilliant. Well, thank you. It's been an honor to have you both as guests on Sentientism, and please do stay in touch.
Yeah, thanks so much, David.
Thanks. Thank you so much. Okay, bye.